Welcome to the Jones Point Navigator series podcast, where we bring together thought leaders and companies at the crossroads of policy, markets, and innovation. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Daina Andries, founder of Epidarus Health, a startup focused on improving the prior authorization process for PBMs. We discussed the inspiration for the name Epidarus and their product Amphitheater, some of the use cases with middle market PBMs and in categories like ADHD and GLP-1 drugs, and the potential uses of blockchain within healthcare. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please consider subscribing to us on Apple or Spotify podcasts.
So we always like to start these conversations with a segment called What's in a Name. It gives you the opportunity to talk about the name Epidarus Health, where it came from, the origin story, and what it means for you and the brand.
Sure. So Epidaurus, it is a bit of a mouthful, but I came up with the name when I co-founded the company 4 years ago. And Epidaurus is a city in Greece. And in ancient Greece, Epidaurus was a destination for people all over the ancient Greek world. People would travel there on a, I guess, pilgrimage, so to speak. But the goal was healing. You could think of it, I guess, also as kind of an ancient spa. But people would, I imagine, try all kinds of remedies, herbs, massage, baths. And over time, people began to exchange information and write down, record what worked and what didn't. So there was this exchange of evidence. And eventually it became much more empirical. People were looking for what was repeatable for certain outcomes. So you can see where this is leading. I liked that motif for a company that is all about exchanging evidence of what actually works and what doesn't. And I just thought it was a very poetic sort of snapshot or metaphor for that transition from moving for more just like, well, let's try it and see, hope and pray it works, versus moving towards something more repeatable and scientific and evidence driven. And Epidaurus, I had never heard of it before Googling it when I was looking for a name, but it's apparently considered the cradle of Western medicine. So Western traditions and how we practice medicine today. I mean, we've all heard of the Hippocratic Oath. There was definitely a Greek undercurrent in Western medicine. So wanted to touch upon that, just our roots, but also so looking back, but looking forward. I think we're currently in the information age in a transition that you could argue is parallel to that time where people might look back at our time and say, man, they were so basic. It's, we were, especially when it comes to how we manage our health benefits. It's, try this. Oh, it didn't work. Well, now try that. Oh, that didn't work. And my vision and hope for the future, and I would love for our company, part of that solution would be you gather the data, it's comprehensive. The providers are able to make a decision based off evidence. And not only is it just your data, like you have a comprehensive history that you can show your care team, but also they have access to a wealth of knowledge across the population so that they can match, cases that are similar and just be continually learning about what works and what doesn't. And lastly, I will add, we are a health tech company. So, I mean, most of my team we're from an engineering background, and our product is called Amphitheater. So in Epidaurus, they're known for this ancient amphitheater. It's built also in antiquity, and it's a masterpiece of acoustics. So no microphones required. And they used to do Greek plays there also as part of healing. So the Greeks believed that, watching tragedy could be cathartic. So you could cry out your disease, I suppose, or your mental problems, could be healed through theater. So I thought that was a very interesting image. But again, we're an engineering company, so we're also about building something that is efficient and optimized. And yeah.
That's fantastic. What a great story, and really, kind of a brand name and a theme for the moment, in a lot of ways, like you touched on, the ancients, they, were bringing together different ideas and trying to categorize what worked and what didn't. And now we have, with only changes, we have the volume of information that we have, and we need different tools to analyze and to get best practices. But it's a great story, and I love the theater element too is particularly intriguing as well. So you touched
I
on
thought
this.
that theater works too. Sorry to just
Oh,
jump in.
absolutely. Good conversation.
I grew up in Philadelphia, and one of the paintings I grew up looking at used to be the Jefferson Medical School, was the Gross Clinic, where you're seeing, I think it's in the 19th century, they're doing operations in the theater. So I thought, oh, also that's like a great image, because people in medicine, used to go, and it was kind of like theater. You watch an operation and you're a student and you're learning and you're taking notes. So I thought that was also an appropriate image for what we're trying to accomplish, where it's a secure area, not, you have to pass a checkpoint to come in to have access. But once you're in, it's a space where that we are in that commons where we can share knowledge, what we learn from on a case by case basis. So
That's fantastic. And yeah, the kind of the way that artists and sculptors capture the kind of practice of medicine over time is pretty telling. So that's pretty cool. So you touched on it a little bit. Love to hear a bit about your background. What drove you to start this company? What was kind of the light bulb moment where you're like, hey, this is what I want to go help, kind of fix and kind of improve the kind of outcomes in healthcare. So I'd love to hear about you and your background and how you started, and then talk a bit about, your company and the product.
sure. So I've been talking so much about poetry and Greek theater that I feel like I should give away, go a little further back in my background. I went to college for philosophy and literature. Um, and then in my mid 20s, pivoted into data. Um, Started out, I was thinking I was going to work in a library, and then I leaned into coding and broke into tech, which was a great fit for me. So I was working as a consultant in DC in data science consulting, working on enterprise blockchain solutions for corporate clients in finance, learning a lot in that space. And my co-founder and boss at the time, we were looking for a way to transfer what we had learned about securing data on an enterprise blockchain, but also exchanging data between two independent organizations for the purposes of settling a transaction. And we wanted to transfer that into a healthcare use case. So we applied for funding to the NSF through the SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Program, got a phase 1 grant. And that basically became my full time. This would have been around 2019. So I transitioned from working with the corporate clients on financial use cases into developing a use case in healthcare, in which I had no prior experience other than that my whole family works in healthcare. But I had very intentionally, as a young woman, decided that I didn't want to touch healthcare with a 10-foot pole. And that was mainly for selfish reasons. I just saw how hard the hours were, and just what a complicated space, because healthcare's, as I see it, been going through a pretty incredible transition since, when I was coming of age, growing up in the 90s. And my family practiced health, like medicine, for generations, going back to my great grandfather. So from one generation to the next, it's been interesting to hear the stories and how different being a doctor is in the US. So, obviously, law, malpractice, everything scaled, and insurance, they're much more powerful players on the stage than they were in the 1920s and 30s and 50s. So I think my dad's generation, I just got to watch him experience that transition. So it felt kind of though like fate, because I had this reason, this funding to research, do a whole discovery process. So not only did I interview, my contacts through my family on the physicians and providers side, nurses, I also interviewed people in insurance. So I just got a variety of perspectives just to get a sense of the landscape, and then hone in on our use case, which is prior authorization for pharmaceuticals. And what drew me to that use case was really, I just kept noticing this trend of in healthcare, you have this interesting blend, unlike other sectors, for example, finance, where it's kind of it's pure quantitative analysis. But in healthcare, you always got this duality of art and science, administrative and clinical. So there's always got to be this sort of weaving together of these interdisciplinary decisions. And I just saw that from a systems perspective, a design perspective, which I'm coming from, it's being done poorly across the board. And it's probably being done poorly because it's super hard to get right. So that's what attracted me to that use case.
That's fantastic. And there's a bunch of things I want to touch on as we get into the conversation, especially on the blockchain and the kind of the use of what we'll talk about a bit about the AI to kind of get to those answers. But I'd love to hear about the Amphitheater, the product, what your vision for it is, what you guys are doing, that thing. Let's start there and level set for everyone listening about, what you guys are doing. And then we can kind of delve into some of the topics here.
Sure. So Amphitheater is a software as a service that's cloud-based and ultimately will be blockchain-based as we gain more traction. The problem that Amphitheater is solving is the exchange of the patient's health records between the payer and various health systems once a request for a prior authorization has been triggered. And for listeners that don't know what a prior authorization is a process that gets triggered when you are prescribed a therapy or a procedure that is not by default covered under your insurance. And so insurance is basically making a request for information to any health system that you've been to so that they can determine what's called medical necessity of that prescribed treatment or procedure. And I also will frame it for people as think of it as a second medical opinion by a clinician who will actually never see you, but they will see your data. So I think it's a controversial process, but again, referring to, there's a lot of perspectives on this and, healthcare, it's very hard to have healthcare at scale. Like we have trade-offs. Before we used to just go to one little practice and you just see one doctor. Now we have access to networks. But with that comes, this issue of communication, transmitting the data, coordination. Our customer is the payer, specifically the pharmacy benefit manager. And their issue is they get these requests for prior authorization in very high volume. And a very high percentage of that volume comes in with incomplete information on the patient. And again, how can you make a fair determination if you don't have a comprehensive, complete, and also reasonably trustworthy account of that patient's history? So that's what they want, and that's what we're working to provide them through Amphitheater. And the way we're doing that is, through integration, through applying metadata standards to ensure interoperability, to make the process of them taking in that data and then being able to process it as frictionless as possible. Unlike some of our direct competitors, we do incorporate AI, but we don't advertise as, this being an AI-driven process or even an end-to-end automated process. I very intentionally say that we're optimizing PA because I always want to emphasize that I believe that this process should always have a human in the loop. I think the final decision should always be made by a qualified clinician. So we're just trying to provide as reliable, trustworthy, and complete a picture of that patient and that patient's case as possible at that point of decision making.
That's a really interesting thesis, core belief for the company, because you mentioned this, prior authorization is a controversial hot button topic politically. There's been lots of back and forth between senators and HHS about the use of of prior authorization in Medicare Advantage. And so I think as you talked about the AI, as everyone rushes to the AI solution for prior auth, potentially as the pendulum swings back to have more of that physician involvement, I think that could be an interesting differentiator, as you mentioned. But I think you're absolutely right. It's something that's very controversial, and especially when you're dealing with medicines and medications. There's a lot of value, I think, in the automation, but ultimately, you got to make sure that people get what they need and most efficacious. So that's a really interesting point that you brought up, and I'm glad you flagged it. So let's just walk through, like, I guess, a hypothetical, right? Let's just talk about kind of a patient, doctor prescribes something for patient, just kind of walk us through a hypothetical of how a PBM would use your product, use Amphitheater, for a basic prescription or more, maybe more complex prescription.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah, I can get pretty specific.
Let's do it.
Ozempic is a very popular
That
topic.
is a good topic. I'm glad we started with the it was in the back of my head, and I was like, I don't want to do the GLP thing, but no, that is a hot topic for everyone now. So let's do it.
Well, that's actually we've got two select classes of drugs for our pilot, ADHD and GLP-1. So I am not a clinician, but I almost feel like I know the criteria for proving Ozempic by heart now. So we'll take Ozempic as our example. You, the patient, are at an appointment with your physician. You discuss it. You think Ozempic is a good solution, but you're interested in weight loss, and that's what it's prescribed for. You can't afford to pay for it out of pocket, and you typically would go to your pharmacy to fill it, and that's where it would be denied. That would trigger a notification on the e-prescribing network that would go to your PBM that's affiliated with your insurance. And they would do a review, and for every drug, in this case Ozempic, they have a set of clinical criteria or clinical guidelines, which is basically just a set of questions. Usually the first and most important question is, what is the diagnosis? Why is this being prescribed? And then it just is a decision tree that branches out into if it was prescribed for type 2 diabetes, what was your last A1C? Have you tried other drugs within this class? Is there data on, how those worked? So basically it's like a consult, and they want to see and answer those questions, like I said before, except they don't have they're not there to talk to you and ask you, or you're a physician. It's all happening over fax currently, most of the time, 80% of the time. But that's another issue, is like but it's all happening over an exchange of information through third parties. And yeah, then if they fill out the questionnaire and it follows, check for what they're looking for. And in this case, probably they're going to say, is, the diagnosis for type 2 diabetes? Oh, it's not. Then it'll be a denial. You can appeal it. But it's just a negotiation, again, always though, based on, is this medically necessary, but then define medically necessary. For their policy, if they only prescribe it for a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, and what is that policy grounded in? Ideally, it would be grounded in science, in what we know about whether this is safe, or because that's another topic as well. But that's basically the process of the review, the application of the clinical guidelines, and the final determination. So I went really into as concrete.
It's fantastic, and it's a helpful way to kind of pull back and talk about. So then, where does Epidarus and Amphitheater fit into that process, right? That's I think starting at a very granular, like you did, is great to kind of extrapolate back to what you guys do and how you make it work better for the patients and the PBMs.
Yeah, so again, the PBM is our customer. So the entity that is working on behalf of the insurer and who owns those clinical guidelines, and they're revising those clinical guidelines on an ongoing basis. They're tracking all kinds of literature and research, especially in the mid-market. We work with PBMs that are have a policy of high clinical engagement. So we're interested in the cutting edge on the clinical side as well. So Amphitheater is a software that they have on their side. And one, it's integrated with sources that are able to provide access for the clinical reviewers working at the PBM to view your records as a patient, which happens all the time. That's, patient data gets sent to insurance all the time. Often get a lot of questions about that, but that's just a fact of our system. That's how things run. Yeah, they also our Amphitheater, we provide vaults so that they can house their clinical guidelines in a secure place. And then we do intend to apply machine learning to speed up just the administrative side. So the querying, the retrieval of that patient data once it's brought in to Amphitheater, into the Amphitheater ecosystem, instead of having them click through a bunch of documents, which they do now. If it comes in, it's scanned in as a PDF and they're clicking through handwritten PDFs. We extract, transform, load all of that data, structure it so that it's machine readable and then can be processed by algorithms, so that essentially all that paperwork and manual labor that has to happen for them to basically queue up a case for review, all of that can be more seamless and automated. And ideally, those questionnaires could even show up in the clinical reviewer's screen pre-filled. But then, of course, it would be on the reviewer at that stage to edit, double check. They could look at the data that was available against the pre-filled questionnaire, and then they make a determination. Not Amphitheater. The human on the other end looks at the data and makes the final approval or denial and writes why.
Got it.
And
So
then that information should come back to the patient, which is something you typically may not get these days. It's just denied or approved, and you don't have any visibility into the policy.
Interesting. So it's getting back to your point about having leveraging the machine learning and some of those more kind of helpful innovations we've had recently, but also keeping the human involved on the back end. That's interesting. I think, again, a good way to keep that, kind of mitigate some of that political pressure from, overuse of AI in the space. Very cool. So one of the things you mentioned is you mentioned blockchain a couple of times, and I'm fascinated by blockchain use cases in healthcare. And I think your vision, really, as we talked about before, is to have it on like a secure cryptographic network. Can you talk to us about what that means, and then kind of why that's important? I mean, I think, obviously secure networks are crucial. It is in the news all the time. You don't have to look any further than Change Healthcare and United to understand why data security, especially in healthcare, is paramount and understandably, contains some pretty severe penalties for those who don't take care of the data. But would love to hear your vision for that. Again, maybe let's start with, what does secure cryptographic network mean for healthcare, and then kind of what your vision of how Epidarus and Amphitheater will utilize it.
Sure. Yeah. So we're still early, and we haven't been able to mature that part of our product as much as we would like, because we're still focused on building traction, because really a secure cryptographic network doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to have one until you actually have a network. So we're piloting with 2 channel partners, and through those partners, basically just 2 PBMs, and 2 PBMs do not a network make. But blockchain, for audience members that are unfamiliar or are still, becoming familiar with that term, you can think of it, I would explain it as someone working in the tech world as just a fancy database. And the reason you would choose this type of database is, 1, the encryption, but 2, the purpose that it serves is is to provide a chronological record, chronological meaning linear, it's a chain with one block being added at a time, and approved block by the network through some type of consensus algorithm. So it's telling a story that the whole network agrees is true. And technically speaking, once that story is written and locked and added to the chain, it's very hard to revise it. So that comes, with affordances and also trade-offs and risks. But why I think that could be afford good or positive breakthroughs in healthcare record keeping is, well, there's been a lot of innovation around just the basic blockchain concept, private, public, hybrid. We're interested in building a hybrid of a private and public distributed ledger infrastructure where basically you can have records that are private and encrypted. You can have your own little private data store, but you can share or make those private data stores accessible to others on the network, but for only a very specific pre-approved type of query or purpose. So they're not going to be able to reach in and view your data. They're not even going to be able to extract that data and pull it into that system. It's going to enable really exciting and interesting things on analytics on the network. So what we are really interested in at Amphitheater is called the federated machine learning. And we've invested in a couple of patents too in the space. Federated machine learning, essentially, you can think of it high level as, I have a data store, you want to ask a question and get an answer out of my data. In a more traditional infrastructure or setup, I would have to grant you some kind of access, or I would have to send you my data and you would pull it into your system. But with federated machine learning, you can ask a question and it never leaves where it lives, and it never is, you never get to see it. So there's that protection, but you still have that ability to exchange high level insights, which I think is, kind of the whole thing we want, one, we're being compliant with HIPAA, but two, there's this paradox in healthcare of, yeah, you have to protect the data, but sometimes it's so siloed that we're actually harming ourselves in the sense that we have incomplete information and people that should have access to that information at a certain time don't. So that's the innovation that we're pursuing, is having an infrastructure that's, on the one hand, highly secure, private, but also when you need a certain type of insight, you are afforded that ability to get it in real time, if that makes sense.
It's a very, very good and thorough explanation, and I think really hits on a lot of the points you talk about for the company, but also for the healthcare industry at large. Right, we're on this cusp of so much promise of all this data and tools that can now analyze it at a very fast and efficient level to improve outcomes. But there's, like everything, there's a trade-off of how much you want out there, and having tools out there like you're talking about that can do it in a way that protects privacy, but also like leads to better outcomes. Like, I'm a techno optimist, so I love the way you described it. But I think that holds a lot of promise. And back to the product, especially on the pharmacy side, right? If we can leverage that kind of shared information to get better prescriptions or better things like that actually improve someone's personal outcomes, like that's seems like a home run for everybody. So your ability to distill these topics into digestible bites is fantastic. So thanks for that. Very cool. One of the things we talked about, we kind of touched on some policy areas a little bit here, some AI. We talked about some PBMs. Like, we always like to ask people about like a policy wish list or magic wand, right? And the good thing about politics is everyone can have an opinion. That's kind of how the system works here. So as you've been building this company, you've been focused on, what is it, some pretty interesting spaces. Would love your kind of thoughts on, hey, this would be great if this happened, or here's an area that we're seeing a challenge, or here's an opportunity that we're going after. Very much open forum here to talk about kind of what you're seeing out there, as Congress and DC is constantly working on stuff like that, but you're on the ground kind of doing it in real time. So yeah, I'll give you the magic wand, and you do with it what you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm no policy expert, but I have been, one thing that's impacted me on the ground has been trying to find affordable avenues as a small startup to just start sourcing patient records under the current frameworks, as a vendor working on behalf of payers. So I have been following and reading up on, policies from the ONC, as regards trusted exchange frameworks and common agreements. And I guess my wish is just that there would be more permitted use cases or more avenues for payers to exchange data for clinical use cases with care providers, as they are called. So what I mean by that is I do understand why payers are excluded to start. Again, because there's a whole bunch of controversy, and I think also tension between the payer universe and the provider universe or the care ecosystem.
To say the least.
I can completely understand the intent that these trusted exchange frameworks, these interoperability initiatives in the public-private space were designed to enable, I guess, well, the permitted use case that's universally admitted is treatment, as it is labeled as such. But everything I've been describing, or the way I frame prior authorization, which never holds water in these types of negotiations, is that it's, a second medical opinion, where you actually have a PharmD or you have an MD that's evaluating this, and but they're not going to see the patient. And that's just how we've structured it. And I could see why that would not be considered a permitted use case under that framework or the current policies that guide those frameworks. However, I think it's people can continually fall through the cracks, because if you're not making access for these types of reviews, or that exchange between the payer universe and the health systems, their universe, seamless as well as secure, then you're essentially blocking access for a lot of people, because most of us in the US can't afford to pay for all of our treatments out of pocket. We need insurance to approve it. And it's the big problem is that there's no avenue that's secure and approved for letting that data flow between those two.
That's an excellent point, and I think to that end, you've seen, more on the, I guess, the kind of provider side or in the services side, as the kind of transparency from 21st century cures has continued to play out, the explosion of innovation, and it seems like, a similar pathway or kind of opening would be incredibly helpful for some of the things you and others are working on. So that does make a lot of sense. I guess a question for you: do you think, is it an issue of like democratization of the information, or just have access to it? Because frequently talk about, especially kind of sidestepping a bit in the AI world, making sure that the rules aren't constructed so only the big players can win.
Yeah.
Is it an issue of democratization of that information, or is it just is it really just, so, step one is the access kind of challenge / opportunity?
maybe it's democratization.
I mean, back
I
to
have
the
to
Greek
think about
analogies. We got to stick with our
that.
Greek analogies on this.
Yeah, well,
Recording. There you go.
democracy for all. Yeah. No, but
Yeah.
I definitely have noticed that, even in these frameworks, it's a public-private collaboration. And I love the fact that it's public-private because I want also to see a more balance of interests. Because if it's just privatized, clearly like this data is actually an asset. I mean, we don't like to think of it that way, but that's one of the, again, idiosyncrasies of healthcare is it's a mix of a lot of things. And if you think of it as a business, there's always a business aspect to healthcare, perhaps unfortunately. Care and business, it's an interesting mix, but that data is an asset, and the bigger, in the privatized world, there's definitely an interest and incentive to build a moat around that data, or at least keep it within networks where, um, if you're not a member of the network, then you don't have access. But so I guess democratization is part of it for sure. But also yeah, and with that, there's just a lot of semantics. So I think prior authorization, you say the word and people get really upset, but I mean, and people are like, well, don't you think it'll go away? And my opinion, or just from my work and research on this, is that no, I don't think it will ever go away as long as we have insurance, and America runs on insurance. It's always going to come back, and it can come back under a different name. But also, when you look at the process, it really is, at its core, a clinical review.
It's the struggle of access and affordability, right? And I think that's a fundamental, issue and kind of feature, not a bug of the system. And right, there always be some sort of version of a prior authorization or a review to make sure it is appropriate. And it's about making sure that people understand, the why, but also building the tools that help get the outcomes, right? Because that's why that's why you go to the pharmacy, that's why you go to the doctor, to get the outcome you want. So that's really well said. So we've touched on a lot of fun topics today. We've gone from Greek history to AI to the blockchain. So would love to kind of hear about, what's next for you guys. Fundraising milestones, building out the business next 12 to 18 months. Would love to just hear more about kind of, what's next for you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, first things first, we're just, one step at a time. So we just closed a family and friends round. And
Congratulations.
thank you.
It's always good to celebrate the accomplishments. Good job.
And we also have a phase two. We're in the middle of a phase two NSF SBIR grant period. So there's funding from that resource as well. So those combined, we have runway to support the current team at least through the next 12 months. And my plan is for us to be laser focused now on product, since we just closed the raise, so that and working with our current partners who are in clinical services, contractors to whom PBMs outsource this operation. So we're doubling down, working really closely with these partners. We are also working on incorporating some pharmacogenomics, which I think is a really exciting frontier, applying, genomics testing to predict whether or not a treatment will be effective for a particular individual. So a lot to work on in product, and our target deadline for our alpha release is this fall, and that will just be a core set of features. Not so much on the data intake, but just more removing all the little administrative frictions on the inside. So we're going to start on the inside, working with the payer, and create a process, just a lot of business process improvement and integration, and a little bit of machine learning to speed up, the goal always being efficiency. And then in parallel, continue to work at what we were discussing earlier, data sourcing and integrations with external sources of patient records and information that are needed to complete these prior authorizations. But that will be more of a beta feature for early next year.
And that's fantastic. And congrats on the success today, and look forward to keeping in touch as you guys roll this out into the fall. Well, Daina, thanks again for joining us on the Navigator Series podcast. We'll look forward to keeping in touch and following you guys as you continue to grow.
Thank you, Tommy. It was a joy to discuss all these, complex topics with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.